It's difficult to know when you launch a show what the show is. If the show runs for long enough, the show will tell you what it is. Your listeners will tell you what it is. Your inner sense of guidance will kind of guide you toward something. It's like, okay, I find this and this and this about the show to be inadequate. It's not giving me what I want. I'd like to change this. And like genre vision has morphed over time.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast life. Today I am joined by my friend Travis Newton, who is the co-host of Genre Vision, and we're going to talk all about DIY podcasting as two people who have made many, many podcast episodes, either largely on our own or with just a couple other people involved in the process. So Travis, how are you doing today?
Doing okay. Thanks for having me on, Deanna.
Yeah, of course. One of the first things I wanted to talk about is the difference between having a podcast with a co-host and having a podcast as just a solo host. I have done both, and I know you are currently in the co-host experience, if you will.
Yeah, I feel utterly incapable of doing podcasting by myself. I am a person who, when removed of other people, does not talk very much. And I would consider myself, between me and my co-host Drew, I'm less of a talker than Drew is. Drew is wonderful. Like, his primary talent is creating things from nothing. Mm-hmm. Whereas my primary talent is creation from a rough product that becomes a finer product, which is why I'm an editor. But yeah, I really can't see myself doing any kind of solo podcast thing that isn't written. I could write something and I could read a script to camera, but I could not sit in front of a microphone and a camera without any kind of pre-written material and make it into a compelling bit of tape. It just would not work for me.
As someone who has done both co-hosting and just like solo podcasts where I'm interviewing people, and now I am alternating between solo episodes and interview episodes, I've kind of experienced the spectrum of different types of podcasting now. And I will have to admit that doing solo episodes is really, really difficult. When I had a Patreon for Welcome to Geekdom and Chat Cemetery, I had tried to do some solo episodes as bonus content for Welcome to Geekdom, which was mostly just me talking about the things I was consuming, which you and Drew do as well on your Patreon. And for pop culture stuff, that's kind of like an easy go-to for extra content. It's like, oh, let me talk about all these other things I've consumed that I don't have a very specific episode on. Even that was still just hard because it just felt like I was talking to a wall, and not having that sort of feedback with someone else kind of makes those a little difficult.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was somebody who, when I grew up, did, things in the arts, whether it be singing in choirs or playing in concert bands or jazz band and orchestra, stuff like that. I was a musician. I was in a ska band for a couple years. I was never used to being just me up there, doing a solo thing. It was always part of a collaborative group where there was other energy to kind of feed off of. There were things to respond to. And yeah, I've just, being the creator of creating something from scratch is not a process that comes easily to me. Mm-hmm. I because I'm an editor, I constantly edit while I'm talking. I can't speak very quickly as a result. My speech pattern is a little slower, and I rely on a lot of filler words to kind of act as a buffer while I'm figuring out exactly what I want to say. So being that kind of person who can just spin stuff up, I realize it's a muscle that you can exercise, and it's something that I think a lot of us can improve on it, but I don't have a whole lot of interest in improving at that, at least in the podcasting sphere. Like my heart really lies with being part of a team, and being part of a team can be difficult. The larger the team is, the more unwieldy it gets, but thankfully Drew and I have a very solid working partnership. Our friendship was founded remotely on working on creative projects together. That is how he and I got together, and that's how he and I maintain our friendship. Even when we're working on things that are very just, he and I also work on content for websites, for instance. He'll write scripts for video essays for his employer, and I recently signed on to do some freelance video editing for them. So like he and I will make stuff together that he and I don't have any sort of emotional investment in, but we always have genre vision, not only to create something, but it bolsters our friendship as well. So it was a partnership founded on the fact that like we just vibe well together when we make stuff.
Yeah, and especially I've noticed with genre vision, there's sort of a same level of excitement for like the stuff that you guys are covering. Not maybe necessarily every single movie, but just like the themes in general, because you guys do monthly themes and that sort of thing. And you can tell. And for me, when I was co-hosting the very first podcast I started, which was called Misaligned, it was a music podcast. When it started, I was like into listening to new music every week and sort of keeping up with everything. And then we hit like episode 100. And at that point, I had moved away from working in music to then working in podcasts. So my interests kind of just like slowly shifted over that 2-year period of that podcast. And it didn't really make sense for it to keep going because I was like, one, our schedules had gotten so insane that we had 3 different iterations of the podcast. Like it was me and 2 co-hosts to start. Then 1 co-host dropped out and we brought on another person. And then the other original co-host dropped out. So then it was just me and 1 other person. And all of that happened over, like I said, 100 episodes. So it still had a good run,
100 episodes is a pretty good run. For a totally independent podcast, 100 episodes is extraordinarily admirable.
Yeah, and that was done in conjunction with Modern Vinyl, but Modern Vinyl wasn't like, hey, we can pay an editor. It was just like, we can post the podcast on the website. You have to do everything else sort of thing. So it was very much still like an indie DIY thing. And then Mirjani Rawls and I, one of my friends who I still text like every day, we had tried to do a sports podcast, but it wasn't a specific sport. It was just sports in general. And that is just so hard. There are so many sports happening all the time that to try and do like even just a weekly sports show, one, it was just hard to schedule around like all of the things going on. And then we were like, okay, do we like alternate what sports we talk about? And even that still ran 30 plus episodes. So I think it wasn't as consistent, but we were probably doing it for about a year. And it's just one of those things where after those 2, I was like, okay, I'm going to just like do podcasts where I have guests on and see how different that experience is, right?
Yeah, no, the wonderful thing about podcasting is like it's such an infinitely kind of malleable and reworkable format. Thankfully, podcasting has still remained a very open format. Even though there are platforms that have kind of tried to like own podcasting, not in the literal sense, but kind of like be the place for podcasts, there are still some that, make sure that it's available everywhere. I really believed in the power of like RSS and things like that back when, it was the early 2000s. I started podcasting in 2011. So I had been aware of podcasts for years before that and have been a loyal listener of, many podcasts in the years since I first got into them, which was probably 2007, something like that. So yeah, it's a cool thing to do. And there are just so many ways to do it. And I feel very fortunate to have found the way to do it that works for me.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that because you and Drew have a specific night of the week where you record your episodes. And I think a lot of that is why it has worked so well for you guys, because like I was saying with mine, schedules were just constantly inconsistent and it's really hard to just like get into something. For me personally, this is just a personal thing. It's not me saying anything against anyone else. It's just very much a me thing where I'm like, I need that consistency of, hey, I know I'm doing this on this day. And then I chose even more chaos and I chose to have guests on and I was largely working around other people's schedules. But in a sense, that was easier for me because I was able to just do it whenever me and one other person were free. And because it was different people each week, there was still sort of this freedom to be like, okay, well, it's easier to get ahead because I can schedule more than one person in a week.
Right. You can bank stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. For you, what have you found to be the most compelling reason for sticking with the co-host format? Because I know every once in a while you guys have had guests on. I've been a guest on your show, but largely you just keep it to you two.
It's difficult to know when you launch a show what the show is. If the show runs for long enough, the show will tell you what it is. Your listeners will tell you what it is. Your inner sense of guidance will kind of guide you toward something. It's like, okay, I find this and this and this about the show to be inadequate. It's not giving me what I want. I'd like to change this. And like Genre Vision has morphed over time to kind of be what it is today, which is the most repeatable thing we can do every week. Because we've decided to stick to a weekly release schedule, obviously we take some weeks off for holidays and vacations and things like that from time to time. But, to stick to that consistent release schedule requires making time in a very consistent way. And thankfully, Drew and I are willing to make that time to record every Thursday evening. And it does inhibit, like we've chosen to devote ourselves to this creative purpose. And are there some Thursday nights where I'd rather be doing something else? Absolutely. Are there some Monday nights where I would rather be not watching the movie we've chosen to watch that week? Like, absolutely. But I use an analogy. I don't like washing the dishes, but I do like having done the dishes, which is why I wash the dishes. Yeah. Because after I've washed them, I can say I've washed them, and that feels good. Drew and I have compared our weekly rhythm to a great rolling wheel. It builds up enough momentum, and once it starts going and going and going, like, don't stand in its way. Like, we got to get an episode out this week. We got to get an episode out this week. It requires a certain level of devotion that is hard to come by in people that don't have the requisite level of passion to suffer through the awkward stages of something.
Yeah. I feel like for anyone who is looking to start a podcast with a co-host, I would highly, highly suggest doing what you and Drew do and just pick a night of the week. It doesn't have to be a night. It can be the day if you don't work, a 9 to 5 or
just some shared time that you're both willing to carve out.
Yeah. And I think the main thing too is knowing that you will have to make some sacrifices if you really want to stick to that schedule and to make it work. And I think that is something that a lot of people have a hard time with. But in the end, I think you and your podcast will both be better off for it, because then you'll just sort of have this consistent thing. In a way, it's like kind of having a 9 to 5. It's like if you show up late too many times or you don't show up at all, you're probably going to get fired, And you have to show up consistently with your podcast if you want it to work. And it doesn't have to be weekly either. This show is every other week.
Yeah, on a regular repeating basis. Yeah, I mean, we've had guests, like we have another show called Finflix that's currently between seasons 2 and 3. We're on hiatus, and eventually we'll release season 3, which you helped us edit some of. And then we've had guests on like seasons 1 and 2, and we know that just based on how the guest affects the energy and like how it changes how I do the edit, that it's not something we would want to do regularly.
Yeah.
We found the only thing that works for us regularly is to do pretty much the same thing every time. And for a lot of people that will bore them, but I really thrive on the consistency. I thrive on the structure. I thrive on the regularity of it. And it sounds like that's something you do as well.
Yeah.
And thankfully, with the format we've chosen, we don't really have to invest any more than the length of a film to consume this. We're not going to sit down, between weeks and watch 3 seasons of Under the Dome. Who would do that, right?
No idea. No one in their right mind.
Yeah. So the investment of it is something that we're willing to do because it's fun. And the show has changed a great deal. And one of the reasons it's changed, like the primary reasons it's changed, is that we're lowering the barrier to entry. We found when COVID began in March of 2020 that we wanted to spend more time together with one another, remotely. He and I live very far apart. So we decided to watch the movies together. And so the fundamental experience of talking about the movie changed And he and I are no longer offering that many differing opinions, because like when he and I would watch movies separately, we would have separate experiences and we'd be comparing and contrasting our separate experiences. Now, when we talk about a movie every week, we're talking about that one time we watched that movie together and it was awesome. And so I think we're overall a lot more positive on the things that we watch. And we've also had to be a lot more choosy about the things that we watch, because like we want to have a good time. And so the curation aspect of what we do also consumes a fair bit of our discussion time. It's not uncommon for Drew and I to record an hour and a half of audio for every week's show or less. We will spend an hour doing a recorded pre-show for our Patreon folks. We will spend an additional hour probably just chit-chatting and, processing our audio from our pre-show, talking about, what's going on in each other's lives, and talking about, scheduling things and other things that we don't want, recorded. So the investment of time is significant, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And you have to accept that when you devote yourself to a creative purpose, that you will lose time to do other things. Sometimes it's things you'd rather be doing. And if you're in a band, you got to go to band practice. You got to play shows. That's just it.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And I have one last note on doing the solo podcast host with guests thing. I've talked about this before, but honestly, the best thing I did for Chat Cemetery was make a spreadsheet to track all of the episodes, all of the guests, what days we were recording. Obviously, I also put the stuff in my calendar for recording times so that I could send Zoom links or Riverside links or whatever I was using to record that one. It was just so helpful to be able to see all of that at a glance and know like exactly what episodes I needed to fill in. And it was so much easier to get ahead that way too, because I could see, oh, hey, the 11/22/63 episode, a book that is over 1,000 pages long, is coming up in like 2 or 3 months. How far ahead can I get on everything else before that so I have more time to read that? And sometimes that worked. Sometimes it didn't. Like I said, Stephen King has written a lot of things. I think there was a stretch where I had 3 book episodes back to back to back, and they were very long books.
There's a lot of stuff I know now through the process of doing this since 2011, not Genre Vision since 2011, but podcasting starting in 2011, and then getting to know other people who podcast and like learning about their formats. When I learned about what you were doing to keep Chat Cemetery and Welcome to Geekdom running, I just thought that is so many things I simply will refuse to do.
Yeah, I was less successful doing that with Welcome to Geekdom. I did have a spreadsheet at one point, but because that one was a little more all over the place and like the Stephen King stuff was at least chronological, I could plan that one a little better. But yeah, doing those 2 podcasts at the same time too. So having 2 weekly shows, that didn't make you any money. that also added to your workload, of editing other podcasts. Yeah, no, it's an undertaking. And like, I want to emphasize the reward of it, because I think it's easy to focus on just how much work it is, because you and I are talking shop. It's easy to sit around and complain about like how much work this stuff is, because it's a lot of work. But the reward, I wouldn't be doing it all these years later if it didn't feel good. Yeah, I loved having all of the conversations that I had about things I loved, things I didn't necessarily love as much. Even when it was something I like actively disliked, it was always a conversation that I was still looking forward to. And a lot of times too, like it was an opportunity to catch up with my friends, because both of those shows were happening largely during COVID. And like you said, I also edit for work. So I'll be honest though, if I had not started podcasting back in 2015, I probably wouldn't be a podcast editor now. I just really fell into this. This was not like something I had intended to do. It wasn't even on my radar as a thing I could do until I started doing it and not getting paid to do it.
Most people I know who work in some sort of professional podcasting capacity stumbled into it.
Yeah.
Because just 15 years ago, it was still kind of a nascent industry. And for people to like say, oh, well, this is someplace where I could make money, I could do this. And they stumble into it. Podcast, for so many people, podcast is just something other people do. The cool thing about it is that, the barrier to entry is rather low, but the barrier to creating exceptional content is always high.
Yes.
And that's true of pretty much any art form, because I do consider podcasting an art. This is something that I don't do for love of money, because it doesn't make me any money.
Yeah. It's a creative outlet.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think without this creative outlet, I would be much worse off. I need some kind of outlet. And I need a level of consistency in my life. And I make a show for people like me who like the kind of consistency of listening to the same dynamic and the same format every week. I'm not a fan of guest-based shows personally. And it's nothing against them. It's just that I don't like listening to a host try and figure out a new dynamic every week. They stick to some of these shows stick to a really open format where they'll just freewheel about whatever. And there have been some shows in the past that I've really liked that done that. Like the stand-up comedian Pete Holmes has a podcast, or had a podcast. I'm not sure if it's still going on, but it's called You Made It Weird. And it was, he'd had another stand-up comic on the show every week. And sometimes they'd sit around just, jaw at each other for 3 hours, and it's, to me, it's kind of painful sometimes to listen to people who are just trying to figure out how to communicate with one another, because I often think about what did the editor have to do to make this conversation flow more naturally? I hear the work that goes into it now, which is why I now like to listen to shows that the editing work is a little bit beyond my capabilities. So it leaves me wondering, how did they do that? I wonder how they did that. Huh. So I like listening to stuff that'll kind of push my boundaries a little bit. And it's a devotion. I mean, I hear people all the time who try to get into tabletop role playing games, and I've certainly played a couple campaigns of Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role playing games, things like that. Trying to schedule 4 or 5 adults who come from different families and live in different households and live in slightly different places. It's just to try to get them to all come together, even online, not having to leave their house, to try to get them all to gather around the table is extraordinarily difficult, because people have got a lot of stuff going on. I'm middle-aged now. People I know got kids. Some people I know got 2 kids. It's that's a higher calling. It's a greater devotion, and I can't for the life of me imagine that if I was a person with kids, I don't think I'd have time for this. And so one of the reasons that I've pursued the life I have is because I have this, and I don't want to give it up. It's fun. It's fun for me.
Yeah. And to each their own. People's priorities change, and that's fine. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I have started and stopped 4 different podcasts before this one. I'm not going to count one of them because it was purposefully a mini series. So that one was a spinoff of Welcome to Geekdom, which I also did with a co-host.
Yeah, and that's fine. Priorities do change. People figure things out as they go, and I've known people who have tried to stop and start different shows, and one of the tips I gave somebody one time is they just kept coming up with ideas for shows, and every time they did that, they would have to go and create a new RSS feed, or they'd try a new host and things like that. And I told them, I said, look, just create, lower the barrier to entry for yourself. Just create a feed that you can call the, insert name here podcast, that every time you have an idea, you can just go put it in that feed and publish it. Yeah. Because if what you're looking for is the thrill of publishing, just, stick it all in the same feed, and eventually, if you publish enough things, maybe you'll find the commonality between them, and maybe you'll hit on something that you want to keep repeating, and you'll build momentum. And you can allow it to change over time.
And even huge networks like The Ringer will do that. They will have one feed that has 3, 4, 5 different shows with different hosts in it. And it's because they're all pop culture based, or they're all about, I think they have a feed called Prestige TV, and different people will review different prestige TV shows. So it's just one of those things where you can come up with sort of this overarching name for the feed, like you were saying, and then just publish stuff there. And as long as you make it clear that that's what you're doing, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I think as long as you state an intention, that's what you want to do. But also, you can start intending to do one thing and then totally change your intention. I was listening to your previous episode about podcast trailers, and it's like, we don't just make one podcast trailer. Like, nobody made a rule that says you just have to make one that lasts forever. Like, no, if you make one and you like it enough, publish it. And then 2 years later, if you don't like it, great, take it down, make another one.
Yeah. Or if it's not relevant to your show anymore, just make a new one that's more relevant to your show. It's fine. You can just swap them out. It's not a big deal at all. But Travis, there is one very specific thing I wanted to talk to you about. And you mentioned it a little earlier when you talked about doing your pre-show for Patreon. One of the things I'm also really big on lately is pre-production and just going into your episodes, knowing exactly what you're talking about, which, full disclosure, I absolutely did not do with Travis on this episode. I did, give us the topic beforehand and kind of give you an idea. But for the most part, you guys do the pre-show for your Patreon, and it's almost like you're doing pre-production in real time sometimes, because you'll have your scheduling episodes where you're working out the themes, you're working out what movies you're going to watch, and you're working out like when those are going to air. And I think that is a really clever way to do some pre-production and use it as content.
I appreciate you saying it's clever. I mean, this is kind of stuff, this approach is all born of Drew and I's love for behind the scenes content, basically. He and I grew up in the golden era of the DVD format, where it was expected that if you were going to buy a movie on DVD as a collector and as a person who enjoyed movies, that was going to come with some material that tells you how the movie was made. And there was a time when they got some really substantial and like truly like monumentally important, like historic documentary films about the process of filmmaking, just as stuff that would be good to put on a DVD. Like, so much money was spent making behind the scenes things because DVDs were hot. People were buying them, and the DVD market was just absolutely on fire. And so the movie studios thought it was worth it. And so Drew and I really grew up on the magic of being allowed behind the curtain. For people like Drew and I, being allowed to see how something functions is crucial to appreciating it. There are plenty of things to appreciate on a surface level, and I can appreciate saying, like, no, I'd rather not see how the sausage is made on something. I would rather just appreciate the polished product. I think there's a lot of things that exist that I would not prefer to think about how exactly they're made. If I eat chicken wings, I don't want to think exactly about how they're butchered, because sometimes, the process of creation is messy. Drew has said that, like, the process of creation is almost always a painful one in some regard. Good art doesn't necessarily require the pain of creation. Something can be easy to make and still be good. But like the process of making something, even if you're not pursuing it as some sort of grand artistic endeavor, like it does involve some pain, and like whatever we're experiencing that week, like when we go into to do the pre-shows and we do our show pre-production, like whatever we're experiencing is going to come out in that. Mm-hmm. And it gives us a chance to kind of warm up before the show proper so that we can be present for the show and deliver a consistent product every week to our listeners. But the wild stuff, and where we can kind of be more unguarded, where we're not putting on a show so much as when we do the pre-shows. And that kind of transparency is something Drew and I really value. I would love to see more podcasts do that. I think I would sign up for more podcast Patreons if they offered that kind of content, because I don't care about early releases. I don't care so much about extended episodes. I don't care so much about like exclusive Patreon only episodes that are of a similar format. I would be looking for something different, but that's just me.
Yeah, it's also something that is sometimes hard to come up with, because you have to factor in, okay, what are people going to be willing to pay for. And like you yourself just mentioned, you're like, I don't really want more of the same, or just to get something like early or ad free, because I'm still kind of getting the same content. I'm just saving, 6 minutes of ads or whatever. And sure, some people are willing to pay for that, and that's totally fine. And that's great for those podcasts. But I struggled with that when I was doing the Patreon for Geekdom and Chat Cemetery, because I was like, okay, not a lot of people know about the Stephen King comics. So I was like, if those episodes wouldn't have as big of an audience anyway, I'll just do those for Patreon, and I'll do like the single TV episodes, like the Twilight Zone episode or what have you, that were adaptations of King stuff. And it still was a lot of the same because I was just talking to a guest. And I do wish I would have thought of something a little more clever for that, or, just something a little more exciting to get more people interested in subscribing. So what I've been doing for this is I've been doing the full episodes that are available to everyone. And then I have bonus content that I just put in my newsletter. So you go subscribe to the newsletter and then you get that bonus content. I'm not trying to paywall anything for this podcast at this point, but Travis, do you have any other tips for DIY podcasters before we go?
When in doubt, mix to mono. People who are new to audio mixing love to find out the possibilities of what they can do in apps like, GarageBand or any of the kind of like free DAWs that are available to download. And messing with audio for the first time is really, really fun. It's one of the reasons I got into DIY music production and podcasting, is because like making music and like making fun stuff with a microphone is just a total blast. But I've found that often in mixing a podcast that less is more. You need to make sure that we can hear you and that we're hearing not a whole lot of everything else. And I've had podcasts, by people who are making podcasts for years, like doing it independently, and they'll pan one host hard right and pan the other one hard left. And I'm thinking, this is murder on my ears. Like, don't do that. Also, there are even some professional podcasts that do this because they're kind of grandfathered into it. They'll have like 1.5 minute long musical intros to their shows. Hell no. I skip it every time. It may be a great song, but like I don't want to hear 1.5 minutes of the same song every week. I want to get to the thing.
Yeah, I get nervous even having like 20 or 30 seconds before someone starts talking. And typically what I will try to do, or try to get clients to do, is have like 5 or 10 seconds tops, have it start fading out, and then you're just like getting into it. And I've also been trying to get better at just diving right into what the thing is that I want to talk about. Obviously, because I have guests on my shows, I want to introduce them and be like, with you on this episode, just be like, hey, here's my friend Travis, here's what he works on, here's what we're talking about today. Get into it. I've listened to podcasts when I was doing a movie podcast deep dive for the newsletter. I came across this one. I don't even remember the name of it anymore at this point, and I wouldn't mention it if I did, but it was like, there was a 4-hour episode on Carrie, which is a movie that I love. And obviously I had a Stephen King podcast, so I hit play on it. It took them an hour to start talking about the movie.
Yeah,
don't do that.
No, there are some podcasts that can kind of get away with that stuff. My wife likes to listen to certain podcasts too. And she listens, like one of her favorite podcasts is called Behind the Bastards, which is about like famous bad people. And like they'll open sometimes with like an extended comedy riff, and like 10 minutes into it I'm like, let's go guys, let's finish up the talk about like doing dirty stuff to sandwiches. Like tee-hee, like we've reached the point of the saturation on this bit, like let's move past it. There are some shows that will have the hosts basically hit record and then riff for a few minutes until they find a big laugh, and they will send the intro out on a big laugh and go into the song and then start the episode. The Besties podcast, which is my favorite video game podcast, does that. There's a very good podcast called If Books Could Kill that also does that. And it helps that the hosts are genuinely funny people who have been writing and riffing and, bouncing laughs off of one another for years. Drew and I have tried to do something similar, but now often we're kind of doing like you do with this show. We'll find a nugget, a little golden nugget from the show that we can put at the beginning to hook people in, and then do our intro and song and dance, and then begin the episode proper. And that was a change we made when we tried publishing the show to YouTube every week.
Yeah.
And eventually we discovered that we got some views on YouTube, but it attracted a different crowd, and we just didn't want to put the effort of publishing the show to YouTube every week because it wasn't a video show. Drew and I are not on camera. And honestly, putting ourselves on camera every week and having to make this a YouTube product every week raises the barrier to entry so high that I would not want to do this anymore. This is an audio show. What I do is an audio show. I don't want to have to worry about what I look like on camera every week. That's too much.
Yep, that's why this show is every other week. If I'm being honest, it's because of the video component of it. I was like, if I'm doing video, I don't know if I could keep up with it every single week, especially given how busy I've been with work. You and I actually had this episode scheduled earlier in the week, and I was just like, I cannot do this at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday.
Yeah, no, and sometimes, Drew and I have to delay recording for all sorts of reasons sometimes, whether it's family obligations or work, if I have a deadline for something for my 9 to 5 that just absolutely has to be met on a Thursday night, we'll record the podcast on another night. But the crucial thing is that he and I are both willing to carve the time out of our schedules to get it done. Yeah, and that does mean that our hobbies are kind of demanding. They're more demanding than a leisure activity. And it's nice to have a hobby that is also a leisure activity. But I feel like our hobby is also a calling, which is not to say it's noble or anything like that. No, he and I are sitting around making fart jokes a lot of the time. So it's very juvenile, but it's still a calling.
Yeah. Well, Travis, thank you so much for joining me. This has been great.
My pleasure. Thank you, Deanna.